II over
Team Bretton Woods III.
Team Bretton Woods III, where we don't have to meet at a big hotel in New Hampshire. We can just run a full node and vote with some software. Heady times in the world, Alex Gladstein.
Yeah, I would say a historic day for me to come back on the pod. Really great to be here in Austin, the Bitcoin capital of the United States of America. Fabulous setup you've got here. And
Thank you.
Just such a great community. Grateful to Unchained for hosting a little book party for me last night, and for the Human Rights Foundation, and excited to dive into the topic du jour with you today.
Well, the topic du jour, for any of you freaks who are unaware, I'm sure most of you are, at this current juncture, Saudi Arabia is in talks with China to begin pricing oil sales to China in yuan, and allowing China to pay for that oil in yuan, which is a direct attack on the petrodollar system, which is incredibly prescient that this is happening today. Again, like you said, because that's exactly what we were going to talk about today anyway, when we planned this recording weeks ago. So things are happening fast.
Yeah, it's a disruption of the international monetary order. And as I was telling Marty before the show, what ended up happening wasn't planned, but it ended up happening was that I ended up producing a 3-part series for Bitcoin Magazine, which is really basically a short book in itself. It's these essays are very long, and they take me many months to research, and I go down various rabbit holes. But essentially, if you look at the 3-part series I've done for Bitcoin Mag, starting with uncovering the hidden costs of the petrodollar, and then moving on to the end of super imperialism, and then my latest, which is the invisible cost of war in the age of quantitative easing, which we'll discuss. The whole point is that the world financial system post Bretton Woods was kind of in 2 stages. The first one, 44 to 71, where the whole world used dollars as their savings account. Essentially, central banks would use dollars, redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce. The system came under tremendous pressure in the 60s due to the United States' expenditures in Vietnam. And essentially there was a run on the dollar, and Nixon decided to, instead of, he could have devalued the dollar, but leaders usually don't like to do that. It's very embarrassing. So instead he just closed the gold window, and the dollar devalued anyway, but it was a new era. So people call 71 to today Bretton Woods II, essentially, where instead of a gold redeemability backing the dollar, there isn't any sort of commodity fix in all. Now, analysts that I agree with, like Luke Groman, have this theory that, and Lynn Alden and others have this theory that we kind of moved into sort of a pseudo backing with a different commodity, with oil. And in 73 and 74, as I discussed in my first essay, Nixon and Kissinger were basically like, oh no, like we've lost the backing of the dollar. The dollar was devaluing really rapidly. It lost half its value against the mark in like 3 or 4 years. It's really crazy how weak the dollar got in those first early years in the 70s. And what was happening at the time was that the oil exporting nations had become independent from their colonial masters, and they had formed this thing called OPEC. And Saudi Arabia was like the swing producer and the kind of, let's say, the master of OPEC. And this coalition basically controlled more than 80% of all the oil that was being pumped out. And they, as a result, or as a reaction to the United States supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War in 73, they ended up raising the price of oil tremendously from, I think it was only a couple dollars per barrel previous to 73, 74, and it went all the way up to like $12. So they had just this enormous amount of new wealth coming in, and Nixon and Kissinger hired this dude off Wall Street, a bond salesman called William Simon, to be the new Treasury Secretary and to figure something out. And they knew that he could sell bonds, and that's really what the United States needed to do. It needed to convince people that its bonds were still worth something. That was the national security goal of the United States. It remains the goal today. And he managed to go to Saudi Arabia. So Simon went to Jeddah. The Crown Prince came to D.C. There was this whole song and dance. Nixon went to Saudi Arabia. It was a huge, huge deal. And basically, the Petrodollar pact was 4 elements. It was on their side. They would price oil in dollars. So you had to, if you were Malawi or Bolivia or whatever, you couldn't use your own currency to pay for oil. You had to use dollars. So you had to go get dollars. So this created huge demand for dollars. And it also made a network effect where it just started to make sense to price everything in dollars. This is a huge, huge deal. And, that was part one. Part two was that the dollars they would earn by selling oil, they would reinvest back into U.S. debt. So they would buy U.S. treasuries, things like that. And we would give them a discount on that debt. It was part of the deal that was originally confidential, and then it was later leaked, and then not leaked, but it was made public in the 90s. So that was their side of the deal, and our side of the deal was we would A, sell them tons of weapons at lower than market prices, and B, protect them. And we have done so. We did so after Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1991, and then we did so again, obviously, in 2003. You can argue the Iraq War was really, again, kind of a protection of this system, right? So the externalities have been vast, and over time, the oil peg, we could say, started to come under pressure. Like basically, it was pretty good from the 70s until the mid 2000s. Like dollars and oil had a pretty tight correlation. Essentially, dollars were pegged to oil. But after like the mid 2000s, the price of oil went beyond $30. And then it like never went back. And Luke Groman has a great conversation on the Grant Williams show that just came out that you should all listen to. It's excellent, where he breaks this down. But essentially, like oil went to like it went to like $150 a barrel. It was insane. So it basically broke the peg. And this happened at a time when the United States had invaded Iraq. It was engaging in enormous new borrowing. There was like that kind of pressure on the dollar, and then the great financial crisis hit. So instead of like raising rates to try and like peg the dollar back to oil, we actually rates went to zero. So as Groman says, what Volcker did at the end of the 70s, early 80s was he sacrificed the American economy for the world, meaning like we made the dollar the priority. So we raised rates all the way up to close to 20% to strengthen the dollar as the world reserve currency, and basically to back up what we promised to the world, that we would make the dollar strong. Bernanke in 2008 did the opposite. He sacrificed the world reserve currency for the banks. So he saved the banks instead of the reserve currency. So we betrayed the world. It's an incredible story, actually. And the reason I'm so interested in this process through all of my writing is that what you start to see is that the United States, in order to achieve its foreign policy aims, needs buyers of its debt. And that was done pre-71. LBJ would call the West Germans and say, basically, you need to buy our debt. And if you don't, we're going to pull out. This happened. So it's coercion. Obviously, the Petrodollar pact, like you, Saudis, all you guys, OPEC, you're going to buy our debt. Then, after they went broke, like basically the price of oil collapsed in the 80s, right? So we needed to find a new buyer, the Japanese. So the Plaza Accord and the Louvre Accord and these things in the 80s were partially an effort to force the new world's second largest economy to buy our debt. So they started racking up our debt. And then as you got through the late 90s, we needed a new buyer. We were getting a little thin. So this explains partially the induction of China into the World Trade Organization, and then between when they got in and started doing business with us at this huge scale, right, that they didn't before, and they basically started making all this stuff for Americans and started earning all these dollars. They started doing the recycling thing that I described before. So previously you had the oil sellers recycling their profits back into U.S. debt. Now you had the Chinese doing it. So between 2004 and 2011, the Chinese went from having just like about $100 billion of treasuries to having more than $1 trillion. They like quadrupled their holdings in a short matter of years. But after the GFC, after kind of the Iraq War peak, Chinese other countries started to like balk at the dollar system. They were like, wait a second, this isn't sustainable. So 2011 was kind of the turning point. After that, after people saw what the U.S. government was willing to do during a crisis, that it was actually willing to sacrifice the dollar in order to please the banks and save the banks, and that this country was willing to borrow all this money to fight these wars abroad, which we'll get into, what happened is that these countries stopped their like accumulation of treasuries. So you had basically foreign buyers in the early 2000s buying about 60% of our new debt that we issued for deficit spending. When I say deficit spending, what I'm referring to is, just to be detailed here, like each year the United States government has a certain amount of revenue through taxes and other streams, and then it has a budget, and sometimes the budget's balanced, but other times we spend more than we bring in, and that deficit, which this year our revenue is 4.3 trillion, and we're going to spend 6 trillion, so we're going to have about 1.7 trillion dollars, give or take, of new debt. That goes onto the debt pile, which is now above 30 trillion, right? And the essential idea is that this debt is very costly to service. So the argument of my latest article is that in this macro environment where you have less and less buyers of our debt abroad, less external less external pressure, you essentially have a situation where the world went from buying 60% of our debt to only 40% today. So what has happened is that the Fed had to step in. Okay, and the Fed has engaged in this unbelievable intervention into the bond markets. So between 2008 and today, the last round of QE sort of quote unquote just ended a few days ago, but we all know it'll restart sometime soon. No, they bought $8.9 trillion of securities, treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. Since March 2020, they've been buying about $4.7 million of these per minute.
It's insane.
So, what would the price of a 10-year treasury be had they bought 0 instead of 9 trillion? Nobody knows, but definitely not 0.08%, which is the overnight rate today, the Fed funds rate. I mean, or it's around 1.7% for a short-term treasury. Like, these are artificially low prices due to government manipulation of the bond markets. And this is very important for the national security state, right? Because to give you an example, like if rates on a pile of $30 trillion debt, if rates rise by 1%, like let's say they go to 1% from 0, that's $300 billion of new money that we owe bondholders, right? That's $300 billion. So if rates go to 3%, which would be like historically reasonable, okay, now you're talking $1 trillion new dollars. So we only make $4 trillion a year in revenue this year. So you're talking potentially, if rates go to 3%, like let's say if they keep hiking like they say they're going to do, you'd be talking a quarter of all of our income going to pay interest. So this is why the U.S. government in the last 20 years, as the petrodollar system has been breaking down, has had to engage in all this in bond market intervention. This is why the Fed has this massive balance sheet. And I felt that was a good way to open.
Yeah, no, and what you just described, essentially over the last 3 decades, the U.S. has just been kicking the can down the road, going to Japan, like, all right, we'll work with you. Like, all right, well ran dry here. All right, China, come to the World Trade Organization. We're going to run with you. And 2008 happens. And like you said, that was an inflection point on the international stage where everybody's like, all right, we can't trust these guys to be the reserve currency. Let's start moving away. And this is where things get interesting. And I had Luke on. You mentioned Luke Roman a few times throughout that explanation. I had him on yesterday, and it's fascinating here in the United States. So the people at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, the academic economists who got us into this mess, they are either intellectually incapable, there's too much pride to recognize the position that they've gotten us. And I think they all understand the position that we're in. They're just, it would be career suicide to admit it, because you essentially, if you're Janet Yellen or Jerome Powell, you'd have to admit that your life's work was all bullshit. And what Luke said yesterday that was very interesting is that he has contacts that are in the Department of Defense and who are wargaming, the game theory of these geopolitical chess pieces that are being moved in the monetary realm right now. And he said the people in the Defense Department realize that we need to make a bold move and move towards what you would describe as Bretton Woods III, and like pulling out a trump card. You have Saudi Arabia cozying up with China, and it's obvious that they want to transition to a new reserve currency regime that either the yuan, the ruble, or a combination of all are a part of. And America, if we want long-term sustainability, what we should do is pivot towards Bitcoin and say, all right, I know you guys want to do this, but we're going to go to this peer-to-peer distributed open monetary network that is free market.
Yeah, and look, the writing's been on the wall for a while. I did the Petrodollar piece a year ago, and even then, like, you could tell that, like, okay, India and China, India and Russia, the EU and Russia, they had started to think about doing trade in other currencies outside of the dollar. So you already, you started to see the weakening. Obviously, Len Nalden has a masterful piece on this. And now it's been expedited by two things. And this is why people are saying Bretton Woods III started essentially in the days after Russia invaded Ukraine. And that's for two reasons. The first one, and the most obvious one, is the weaponization of FX reserves, which I would imagine that most sovereigns thought could happen. But and we got a warning when we stole the Afghans' money, right? When we basically froze the deposits of the Afghan nation, right? This should have been a signal to the rest of the world that that's what the U.S. was going to do. But it's still been shocking for the world to see America and its European allies freeze hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian savings, essentially, right? So now, and this is what this guy Zoltan from Credit Suisse came out with this kind of amazing, note a few days ago that I thought was fake at first.
You thought that was fake?
I literally, because he's such a respected guy on Wall Street. Everybody says he's like, the most important person studying money markets and all these things. And he writes this really breathtaking quick article about how it's Bretton Woods III, Bretton Woods II's done, dollar-based liabilities as a savings account for a nation is no longer an option for other sovereigns. They can't entirely rely on something that can be frozen. So he has this concept of inside and outside money, and he's basically saying the era of inside money being savings for competing countries is coming to an end because they realize they need outside money. And of course, in his conception, among classical economic theory, that's gold. So gold is outside money. But as we know, Bitcoin is digital outside money. It's the only digital outside money. Every other digital asset has some sort of person in control or group in control, or its issuance is going to change or whatever. So we have Bitcoin as the digital outside money, and indeed at the end of his note he basically says if Bitcoin survives, it'll benefit in this thing, which was a shocking thing to see from someone who's that respected on Wall Street. That's what I mean. But so we're at this moment where we have the end of the petrodollar system is being expedited by the weaponization of FX reserves, and now, like, basically the fraying of the actual petrodollar mechanism itself. And it's important worth noting that 25% of all the oil that Saudi Arabia sells is to China. So if all of a sudden you have, and we don't know what's going to happen, but like if it does proceed in this direction and they start pricing and selling 25% of their exports in yuan instead of dollars, okay, then you have a whole range of new contracts and derivatives that are going to be priced in yuan. And I'm not someone who believes the yuan will ever be the world reserve currency. It's not a freely tradable currency. They don't have open capital markets.
Yeah,
it can't work.
If you think the Fed and the Treasury are messing up the dollar, I can't imagine what the CCP is going to do.
Well, no, but like no one would. There's a reason why only 2% of reserves are held globally in yuan, and only about that much trade is done in it, and it will increase, but it's because the markets don't trust the CCP. I don't blame them. And so what we're looking at in fiat land is just a more of a balanced picture that probably more accurately reflects the size of economies and the size of trade, as opposed to today, where we still have the remnants of this dollar hegemonic system, where even though the U.S. has only 20% of GDP globally, we represent 40% of all debt and 60% of all reserves and 90% of all trade. Like that system's coming to an end. It's deteriorating. Okay. And what we just have seen in the last few weeks are, like, as Luke calls them, like really obvious signposts that things are starting to move more quickly, maybe. I mean, it's definitely you're going to have this gradually then suddenly thing. I appreciate the perspective of the dollar bulls that they point out correctly that, look, at times of panic, people still want dollars. It's the best of all the fiats. But that is, that's something that gets eroded slowly over time. And eventually, there's going to be a suddenly part,
Yeah.
And we don't know when that's going to be, but we have to be paying very close attention to this at this point.
Yes, and so the dollar bulls, again, respect and understand their perspective as well. They focus on the technical mechanical aspect of it, like pure demand for dollars, but and they completely neglect the social aspect, and that's what leads to a rapid decline in confidence in the dollar is the social aspect of it. Like, do I believe that the U.S. government is going to be able to pay back these treasuries?
Well,
and
our friend Nick Carter just made a joke about the dollar needs to find new
better tokenomics.
better tokenomics, and it's true. Like literally, what you need to remember is that the literal mechanism that has underpinned dollar hegemony since the early 70s is coming undone. Like, and not just theoretically. Like the mechanism that I laid out, the 4 parts, the pact between the head of OPEC and the world's largest economy. The key part of that is that they price all oil sales in dollars. We are potentially watching that just get wrecked. Like, so what are U.S. policymakers to do? Now, Biden was discussing going to Saudi Arabia. It doesn't look like he's actually going to go, and instead Xi Jinping's going to go. So after Ramadan, so it'll be his first trip there since 2016, and I mean it's a big deal. And I think this is sort of inevitable that like you start seeing China and Saudi Arabia and Russia and potentially India just doing more with one another. Just makes sense. I mean for them, just to take a real politique view, like that would make sense. So for U.S. policymakers, we'll see. But the picture I wanted to dig into a little bit here on the show today was this idea of like, one of the reasons we've seen a decline in American power is that we misused it at our apex, in my opinion, by invading Iraq. Like, so this to me was, and you could argue Afghanistan, of course, is part of that, but really the invasion of Iraq is what sort of, I mean, I view it as an unethical war, and I view it as something that changed forever the course of not just the dollar, but also the United States. Not just in how people view us as a nation. Like even the most like uneducated person abroad knew at the time that like, oh, they're like going in for natural resources or money or something. Like we were not looked upon fondly for during that time, like from abroad. Let's put it that way. Like Americans when they were traveling at the time had to, pretend to be Canadians. Like that's how unpopular we were. Because it was such a ridiculous war. I mean, to me, it's similarly unethical to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Like we sent more than 1 million young Americans to the desert to fight for what? Like at the end of the day, as I try to do in my research and writing, my argument is that it was largely to protect this petrodollar system. But again, this thing is collapsing, and what has happened is that. And this is where we'll get into the content of the third essay, The Invisible Cost of War in the Age of QE. I read 2 books at the beginning of this year that really made me think. And I spent kind of 2 months fashioning this thesis around these, content from these 2 books. One was The Lords of Easy Money by Christopher Leonard, which is about basically Greenspan economics and how the Fed made this decision in the 90s to focus on 3 things. They would basically fight consumer price inflation, they would ignore asset inflation, and they would bail out the economy whenever it collapsed. And that easy money monetary policy is one piece. And the other piece is a book called Taxing Wars by this Air Force veteran named Sarah Krebs, who's at West Point and teaches at other universities. She wrote a phenomenal book about the history of war finance in the United States, and basically like how through the first 2/3 of the 20th century, Americans paid for wars in a way that kind of had a democratic character to it, like meaning that the people were very involved. Like the wars, World War I was paid 30% by taxes, World War II 50%, Korea 100%. So like Americans knew what was going on and they were paying for it. And these wars were, popular is a tricky word, but they were generally supported by the public, not just through taxes, but also through war bonds, or liberty bonds, as they called them. But I thought this was staggering, this stat. In World War II, 85 million Americans, half the country, bought liberty bonds. And the in 2022 dollars, the amount, it would be today about $3 trillion. So that's half of our, basically half of our federal budget. So Americans really chipped in. They had skin in the game. They were involved. They knew what was going on. The government was more transparent. So if you bought during World War II, if you contributed if you bought war bonds, the government would report back to you on what it bought. So there's this amazing story on the New York Fed's website about New York Fed employees who at the time had raised the equivalent, back then about 80 grand to contribute to the effort. The army would get back to them and it told them we bought like this plane and this missile with it.
Nice.
Which is, like again, all wars bad, but look, there are existential wars. There are just wars. You can certainly argue World War II was one of those. And Americans were, especially after Pearl Harbor, getting attacked by the Japanese, Americans were generally speaking willing to fight. Okay? You saw this recently, and there was a great video of this young UFC guy. And he was like, listen, if Putin comes over here, I'm going to fuck him up.
Yeah.
Like, no question. But I ain't going over there.
Bryce Mitchell.
Yeah. So, and that was I mean, Americans didn't want to get involved in World War II. But when the Japanese bombed us, totally changed the equation. People were absolutely willing. Not only did they go conscription, and they, like, my grandfather was over there, and like so many of our families were there, but we paid for it, right? And the thing is, what Sarah Krebs realizes in her work is that politicians realized that taxing for wars was unpopular. Like, eventually, Truman, like, it was, his downfall, and then when LBJ tried to do a war tax for Vietnam, it led to his downfall. He ended up not seeking another term. It was so unpopular. We never did another war tax after 1967. We haven't done one. So all of America's post-Vietnam wars, especially the post-9/11 forever wars, have not been financed by taxes or by war bonds. And that's just like a staggering thing to think about.
Car, I think it's a good time to pull up the thread on the screen.
Yeah, we can start going through some numbers here.
We got some hard numbers on this, and it's just
So again, like, the traditional way to finance wars was in large part through taxes and through war bonds. Today we don't have either of those things. There was a limited Patriot bond thing, but between 2001 and 2011, but it was a very, very minuscule part of the overall war on terror. But when we talk about the global war on terror and these wars in Asia and in the Middle East, what's incredible is that instead of paying as we go, which has a cost, we're paying principal and interest now. Okay, so the interest payments alone that we've made towards the money that we borrowed to fight for these wars in Asia and the Middle East have amounted to $1 trillion. So Americans have paid $1 trillion over the last 20 years only on interest payments. Now let's think about what else we could have done with that $1 trillion. I mean, to forget, like, I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. Maybe it's better domestic investment. Maybe it's tax breaks. Maybe it's God knows what. I mean, it doesn't. If you're Republican, Democrat, you'll have different ideas on where to spend the money. But like, the point is, that's insane, right? And just to give context again, the federal budget this year is $6 trillion. So even if we stop these wars today, and I'll get into what those wars are in a second, but even if we stopped spending on them today, which is partly impossible because one of the biggest costs is veteran benefits. We had almost 3 million troops serve overseas during this time, and they all are, they deserve support from us for fighting for us. So even if we disagree with the fight, so they're going to get these benefits, and those are going to be in the trillions. So the deal is by 2030, we'll have paid $2 trillion, even if we stop fighting today. And by 2050, we'll have paid $6.5 trillion, which again is larger than our entire federal budget.
It's crazy how just like the concept of trillions has become so
and again
normalized
this is just
and
on interest borrowing for the wars.
Yes.
That leaves aside the whole, like, we don't know how we're going to pay for the entitlements.
Yeah,
that's
Social
a separate
Security,
thing. Yeah,
all that shit. Yeah.
Again, these numbers to give the listener, the viewer context. Like, again, like, war used to be something that was like consciously paid for. People were involved. Like, there was a debate. There was oversight. There was like public knowledge about the wars.
There was a vote.
Yeah, there were votes. Like, again, 30% of World War I paid for by taxes, 50% of World War II, 100% of the Korean War, 0% of Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, just think about that. I think that's very powerful. And Sarah Krebs notes that in her research that wars that are paid for with tax increases are 20% less popular than wars that aren't. So that explains those figures you're seeing there. Like, politicians during Vietnam realized that it was suicide, essentially. So much so that in 2007, during the Iraq surge, a bunch of a bipartisan group of senators and congressmen got together and said we should have a war tax. And Nancy Pelosi was basically like, no way, that's crazy. And they were laughed away. I mean, this is crazy. So, again, no new war taxes since 668. None.
Well, let's pause here and dive into. So there's no overt war tax, right? Where you're like getting your tax bill and it's like, all right, I got to pay 2% for the war.
It would say it.
But you are being taxed for these wars via inflation. I think that's like the important thing. Like, it's just hidden in the cost of inflation, which is you are like, even though you're not consciously looking at a tax bill that says, all right, here's your Social Security tax, here's your healthcare tax, here's your war tax, and which would be. It's so weird how social we are, and how it's all perception. Like, we are paying the tax, but it's just not visible to us.
Well, we call them credit card wars. This is the age of credit card wars, and not only are they paid for by future generations by just pushing it off, and now we're paying P&I, we're paying an interest, we're paying those. But yes, you're right. Like, so what's happened over time is these Greenspan easy monetary policies have resulted first and foremost in asset inflation, which causes huge inequality in society, massive. I mean, if you look at, I'll get into the numbers in a second, but causes big inequality. But also, it opens the door for actual, like, what they call, real economy inflation whenever the government has to do actual spending. Like, for example, those stimmy checks, like, like you do trillions of dollars of that, it's going to cause like the crazy CPI we're seeing now, it's historic, highest since 40 years ago. The QE itself doesn't necessarily cause that, but it causes like wild asset inflation and encourages stock buybacks and all these things. But when you mix them together, when you have a government that's willing to sell bonds to fight war, and then have with one hand, and have the other arm of its government, the other hand, the Fed, buy those very things from the private sector, over time, this has consequences. Like, and the goal, again, is just to artificially in quotes, drive the value up of U.S. debt and because with a bond, the more valuable it is, the lower the yield. So, like, basically, you want the U.S. government wants its debt to be really valuable so that its borrowing cost can be very, very low. Mm-hmm. Like, in a world where its securities, we only have to pay 1 or 2 or 3% on them, we can fight a lot more forever wars that the public doesn't know about. But in a world where we're going to go probably, where our debt's not going to be at 0 or 1 or 2%, but it's actually going to probably be at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6%, all of a sudden it becomes impossible to fight these forever wars that nobody knows about. I mean, we just can't pay for them. And that's the kicker.
Yeah, it's
like each percent matters. Each 100 basis points is an enormous cost.
We're mathematically backed into the corner. We cannot get out of this corner. If the interest rate goes too high, we essentially have to default on our debt or just drive it lower into negative territory.
Yeah, and again, some of these numbers, like, to give you an example of a war that's paid for in this way, Operation Inherent Resolve is a war that most people don't know about. It's a war that's been happening in 3 countries: Libya, Syria, Iraq. Obama started it. It's 8 years old, and it's cost tens of billions of dollars. And voters don't know about this war.
No.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know about the war, and I'm like supposed to be an expert in this stuff.
Didn't we used to have to vote to go to war? Like, wasn't there?
Well, the whole, and we can pause here for a second. The whole point of Krebs's book is there's this thing called democratic peace theory, and the whole point of democratic peace theory, which I kind of used to subscribe to, and still in a way do, is that democracies are less belligerent than dictatorships because there is like this back and forth with the people that you kind of have to have. Like, if your leaders do some unpopular war that you don't like, you're gonna like vote them out. That's the whole point. That's what makes us different than Putin. That's the hope, right? The problem is, the flaw of democratic peace theory is fiat central banking. Basically, is my thesis. Like, if the rulers can figure out a way to fight wars without taxation and without raising interest rates through QE, then it's kind of like the magic trick. They can pay for wars, without really the population noticing, right? Because it's as you say, the costs are hidden, right? And that's something that would be shocking to people throughout history. Like basically, if you looked at Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill or even Keynes himself, they all said borrowing for war is a bad idea. They literally all say this: borrowing for war is a bad idea, especially if interest rates rise. But if you have to do it, you have to pair it with taxes. That was like the whole thing. Keynes had this whole book about how to pay for World War II, and it was all about taxes. Okay, it was his vision to like have more taxes, and that's indeed what happened, right, during that war. But if you have like a world where there are no taxes, you start to disassociate these wars from the people. So if Americans aren't paying for the wars, and if their children are no longer being conscripted into the wars, we no longer have the draft, right? And if more and more of the stuff's being done with robotics and AI and things like that, okay, drones, you start to have a population that's disconnected both in blood and treasure from the wars, and that's dangerous, and it, in my opinion, it erodes democracy.
It becomes abstracted in every way.
Totally. Like, and Pew did all this polling, like, all of us, some of us remember, I was young, I was in high school when 9/11 happened, but I vividly remember the Iraq War, and it was really unpopular among a certain segment of society for a few years. Like, there were the biggest protests since Vietnam. It was constantly in the news. And then, and you can be cynical about why, but like basically like 07, 08, it just started to, and a lot of this had to do with Obama being elected, right? But like it just started to disappear as like a topic. And by 11, 12, when Pew would run polling, people would basically say that war was not a part of their lives and wasn't really even a part of their discussions anymore. It certainly isn't today. So, I think it's dangerous, and I think that we need a monetary standard. We need a financial system where governments like basically have to have some sort of consensual process with their people to fight wars. That's what I think's the right thing. And we did have that at one point. It meant that like things had to get real serious. Like imagine how willing today we are to like go fight these things around the world. We were unwilling to get involved with stopping the freaking Holocaust, basically, until the Japanese bombed us. Like, that's the threshold we had as a country, because we weren't on this infinite fiat money standard. It's very expensive, and we knew that it was a big sacrifice. Today, we're just in a totally different mind frame as a country, meaning our policymakers, they know they can go and do all this stuff, and it's going to be hidden. And I just think this is such a huge problem for the United States.
Well, then I completely agree. The warmongering, the war machine, the military-industrial complex has gotten completely out of hand, in my opinion. I mean, the fact that there's essentially a genocide going on in Yemen right now that most people don't even know about, that we're supporting
through our support for Saudi Arabia,
via the armament of Saudi Arabia. I read a stat the other day that there's hundreds of thousands, I forget the exact number, hundreds of thousands of people have died in Yemen over the last X number of years, 70% of them being toddlers or children.
And that's an externality of the petrodollar system.
Yeah.
Well,
that gets to the question.
Yeah.
And this is something Bitcoiners talk about a lot.
Yeah.
Me and Bitcoin fixes this. And does Bitcoin fix this? And this is where I think we have to be up front. Like, Bitcoin's not going to end wars, but I think it brings back the transparent cost of war that you've just been describing that existed 70 years ago.
Yeah, and this is a big debate, but here are some facts. Like, the reason why Britain and Germany left the gold standard in 1913-14 was to fight World War I, which was a monstrous war that really, I mean, it was just a total insane tragedy. There was no actual reason for these countries to fight each other, and they killed millions, right? And then the reason why the United States basically ended Bretton Woods I and left the gold standard formally was to fight the Vietnam War. So war and constraint of money are very related. Like governments try to get around constraints in the same way that governments tried to get around the gold constraint. As I've described in the last 20 minutes, they figured out how to get around the taxation constraint eventually by doing QE, which, by the way, as was pointed out by Saif in his book, The Fiat Standard, the whole idea of QE, of like governments buying their own bonds, was arguably invented by the British in World War I. They tried to do a bond sale and nobody wanted to buy them, so they secretly bought it themselves, driving up the price of the bond and down the borrowing cost. And the U.S. did this in World War II. if you want to look this up, yield curve control is this idea of not just controlling the short-term price of debt, but also the long-term. And we essentially pegged all treasuries at a particular amount so that we wouldn't owe a lot. And what happens, as Lynn Alden talks a lot about in her work, is that this is what's essentially known as financial repression. During times of yield curve control, if you hold any dollar-based assets, you just lose money. Like you're it's negative. It's basically when the interest rates are way below the inflation rate, you're just getting eaten alive. So anyone holding bonds or dollars in the 40s was toast. And that could be a very similar situation. Now is starting to resemble that in many ways, because we have CPI is about 8%, and the Fed funds rate is 0. So
CPI is 8%, and that's understating things.
Yes, like we don't have to get that's not rent. That's not a Costco basket. That's just what they describe.
Yes, it's the melting ice cube that Sailor describes. Right, like that's if you're holding these assets on your balance sheet.
So I get into this at the end of the essay, but basically, like, I don't think that any kind of monetary standard ends all wars, but I think that these like exotic forever wars in faraway places that don't mean a lot to the American people, in a system that had more constraint, I just think my argument is they would be first on the chopping block. Like, we'd be like, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. And what's interesting is, you look at this from the progressive point of view, and people are worried about, well, what about, oh my God, like, what about entitlements? Well, guess what? Most entitlements are paid for by taxes. It had nothing to do with the monetary system. Out of the 3 trillion income that the United States government makes every year, most of that goes to pay for entitlements straight away through payroll taxes and other things. If you actually look at the mechanics of where all the money comes from, I think that regardless of monetary standard, when you have a nation or a community, like they're basically going to want whatever taxes they pay to go towards things like entitlement and domestic local infrastructure spending, and not exotic forever wars. That's the point. The forever wars as we know them would be impossible in a Bitcoin standard. That's the thesis. And we might be heading to a Bitcoin standard.
Yeah. So let's talk to how do you see this playing out, like the transition to a Bitcoin standard? So right now, obviously, we have Saudi Arabia and China talking. Russia's moving away. People are moving away from the dollar. Bretton Woods II is over, as we've described. And what I think is going to happen is you're going to have like this Cambrian explosion of just fractured monetary, like a fractured monetary system where people are buying things in yuan, rubles, dollars, pesos, whatever it may be. And then over time, that's going to become so obviously filled with friction that people are going to be like, okay, we need to consolidate on something. And then it's going to Cambrian explosion out and then suck back into Bitcoin slowly but surely over the course of this decade.
Yeah, so there's two forces at work. And, as I mentioned this at the end of my Petrodollar piece, but like scholars have pointed out four potential visions of the monetary future. One is essentially like dollar continues to be dominant. One is that we go back into like a bipolar world where, let's say, yuan dollar, okay? One is that we have like a Bancorp type money that we internationally manage all together. This is like what Keynes proposed at Bretton Woods.
Like a massive SDR.
Basically, yeah. And then one would be essentially anarchy, where like we'd all kind of, in a depressionary kind of environment, all kind of retreat into autarky and like all would have our own thing. What I think scholars miss is the fifth idea, which is the Bitcoin standard, right? So that's my perspective, is there's a fifth option. And it's driven by one thing mainly, not necessarily this thing you're seeing where the Saudis are now dancing with the Chinese, like, that would result, that on its own would result maybe in a bipolar world in terms of currency, or even in a more autarkic world. But the real thing that happened that points us more to the Bitcoin standard is the weaponization of FX reserves. Because if you're China or Russia, like if you're China and now you want to invade Taiwan, you know that the moment you invade Taiwan, $1 trillion of your assets are going to get frozen. So all of these other countries, whether they be large or small, or even if they're allies of ours, even if you're Europe, they're thinking now, oh my God, like we don't actually own our savings. So inevitably, you're going to see a diversification in the coming decade of central banks into outside money, into something that someone else that is not a liability, into something that someone else doesn't control. Now, is that gold? Is that some sort of commodity flow? Is that Bitcoin? We will see. But my thesis is that Bitcoin makes the most sense due to how flexible it is. Like Putin's got all this gold. It's in a basement in Moscow. It's not very practical. Like what, he's got to put on a truck to send to India to buy something. Like you could email it with Bitcoin. Like it's just like once you start grasping how revolutionary Bitcoin is, you start to see it fitting into this model. And look, the world's just the answer, dear Bitcoiners, is the world's not ready for Bitcoin yet. They don't get it. So even though we have these like we're watching history happen, we're kind of like sitting here in our little bubble being like, wow, that would be a really interesting thing for Bitcoin to be used for. But like the world's just not ready for it yet. Bitcoin's not big enough. There's not enough liquidity. Not enough people trust it. It's just not right. It's not there yet. But as you know, Parker says, gradually then suddenly, like eventually it's going to be there and it's going to take its place. And my general thesis would be eventually central bank reserves are probably either Bitcoin dominant or even just fully BTC. And then everything else is built on top. I still think there'll be, of course, bond markets, stock markets, all kinds of debt instruments, all kinds of insurance. That I think all that's still going to exist in a Bitcoin standard. It's just there's just going to be like a restraint.
Yeah, there's going to be hard reserves that you can verify are there and you can restrain
easily
the expense.
And I think the way it might pan out is you know, I've learned a lot about this possibility from the research I did for the super imperialism piece, which is basically an essay about how did the U.S. government kill gold as a competitor, okay, to the dollar. And you know, after World War I, there was this thing called the gold exchange standard, which really reflected what Bretton Woods would be, and that's the idea of like a handful of people issuing liabilities that are pegged to a commodity, right? So don't use the gold itself, but you would use dollars, which are pegged to gold, right? So what maybe happens here is like a Bitcoin exchange standard for certain countries. So maybe you would have a country whose liabilities are redeemable for some amount of Bitcoin, okay? Just like Bretton Woods, where let's say it's, I'll just, you think about something like this, like $1,000 per 100 Satoshis. Or you'd figure out some exchange rate, like $35 per ounce of gold. And, dollars would have to be redeemable at that rate. And if this would be agreed upon, it would cause a natural balancing of trade and harmony among nations, really. I mean, that was the dream of the Bancor. That and Luke describes this well, like, and so does Lynn and many others. But like the general concept of trade is quite simple. Like, if you're a country that's, basically, if your exports are doing really well, you start to earn more money, and then your money gets more valuable, and then your exports start to become less competitive, and then you sell less, and it's all just a balancing act. Like international monetary flow is a natural balancing act, except for the reserve currency. This is the Triffin dilemma. Except for the dollar right now, we are in this unique position where, like, the more powerful the dollar gets, the more debt we have. It's the total opposite. For any other country, the more valuable their currency gets, the less competitive their exports get, and it's a natural balancing act. It's something that like ebbs and flows. It's actually kind of a beautiful thing when you think about it. But this dollar structure has ruined that for us, at least, and everybody else needs dollars. So we have this. You look at any of these graphs of like net import-export position, and it's like we're kind of balanced until the petrodollar system begins, and then it's like it's insane. So the idea would be moving back to some sort of standard where there are still obviously dominant nations, and there are still fiats that are more dominant than others, but they're like kind of pegged to some amount of Bitcoin. So I think that countries like the United States, China, Russia will eventually have to establish a Bitcoin position, potentially through a national mining effort, potentially through just straight, like, they might just spend their fiat down and buy Bitcoin. This is what, like, what countries like Russia would do. the reason, so the government was printing rubles to buy Bitcoin, to buy gold off the private market, right?
Yes.
So you might see that, and of course we all know what happens to the Bitcoin price in this circumstance. But like, I just view that as inevitable. I think that's so obvious that that's eventually going to happen.
I think so. I think it's inevitable too. However, I don't think that, like, in the U.S. particularly, again, I don't think the Treasury or the Fed is ever going to muster up the confidence to do that, because they're so hubristic and egotistical and worried about their reputation. But I do think so. So what you just described there, Hal Finney wrote about it in December 2010, the free banking system, essentially. So I think I would sort of differ from the explanation that you laid out is, I think we'll see the free market create these basically currencies or monies on top of Bitcoin,
like paper Bitcoin, basically,
in a free banking type system.
Yeah,
we've had free banking exist in Canada in the 1800s, Scotland as well, and Bitcoin actually does provide the perfect reserve asset to try to restart a free banking system globally. And so what I think is going to happen here in the United States, and already is happening, and most people don't realize it yet, is the energy sector is going to force the issue. It's going to force America to adopt a Bitcoin standard, because Bitcoin mining, like you just said, we don't need a national mining effort. What we just need to do is keep allowing the private sector to integrate Bitcoin mining operations into their stack. They're going to start getting Bitcoin as treasury, as a treasury asset on their balance sheets, and then particularly oil and gas companies are the ones that I've spoken to that are most open to this. They'll start like asking to get paid in Bitcoin. They'll realize the value of their natural gas getting converted into sats and see how much more value that's driving.
Then the equities in these companies will rise over time.
Yes, and then and then energy is the base of what we have today, and like it's going to be extremely hard for the U.S. government to go to the people providing the country with energy and say, hey, you got to stop this Bitcoin thing. They'll be like, hey, we're providing energy, and this Bitcoin thing is really good for our business. Like, you really do not want to prevent us from doing
I think short term, you're exactly right that will happen. But let's be realistic. Not every country is a free market capitalist structure, and a lot of these countries are going to have coercive or not.
No, we've already seen it in Venezuela.
They're going to have nationalized mining operations. Now, the other thing to think about is that
that was a purely American perspective.
But also it could. I mean, look, the EU didn't shoot itself in the face yesterday, and they did not ban proof of work. So maybe you'll see some European innovation. Who knows? I think that this whole thing with the invasion of Ukraine has been quite instructive for the German people in terms of like they need energy sovereignty and they need to innovate in this area. And I think people will figure out that if they're just smart and self-interested, they will figure out that Bitcoin mining is a very important part of any innovative electric grid. Like, this is just key. So you'll see, I think, more come online there as well. And we'll have to see, but that's short term. Longer term, you start thinking about taxation, right? So longer term, it's like, well, the state at some point is not going to want. It's not necessary. I mean, even though that the collection of taxation and fiat drives the value of that fiat, eventually it's going to also want your Bitcoin, right? So so when we talk about a state, even the United States Fed, like building up a reserve, I mean, it may do that in two ways. So first of all, it's got all this Bitcoin from the Bitfinex hack. Like, we don't,
what is going to happen with that?
But like, technically, that's currently on the U.S. government's balance sheet. Like, are they going to give it to the Bitfinex company is whole because of this Leo token thing? So that it made people who chose to go that route whole, and we'll see.
There's a number of things to consider with this. What is it? 90,564 Bitcoin, I believe. It's
a massive amount of
billions
Bitcoin.
of dollars of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Bitfinex and the U.S. government do not like each other. They are embroiled in battles over Tether specifically. Like you said, people were made whole. I think it's Bitfinex's Bitcoin, they should get it back. But I do see it as a political chess piece that the U.S. may just be like, sorry, Bitfinex, we're going to keep this.
It'll be so interesting to watch what they do, because if they don't decide, and this will happen probably in the next 12 months, if they decide for whatever reason they're not giving it back to Bitfinex, okay, are they going to sell it for their own fiat currency, which would be really, obviously, you and I would think that would be a dumb decision for them. But they might, which would indicate they haven't figured it out yet.
I mean,
they just hold it.
They've already done it before. Like the Silk Road coins, they sold 30,000 of them at $300.
Yeah, but look, I will be generous with people who didn't understand Bitcoin a couple years ago.
Yes.
You know what I mean? It was so risky then. I
Yeah,
mean,
no, I agree. I'm saying hopefully the Silk Road auction is a massive lesson for these people and at that in the government where they're like, all right, we sold all this at 300. Now it's hovering around 40K. Like
either way, what I'm saying is there's different ways that the U.S. government may build a position. It might be through confiscation and crime enforcement. It might be through mining. It might just be through taxation. Like, again, if you're a citizen and you have the option, you're never going to choose willingly, though, to pay your taxes in Bitcoin, like I would imagine.
No,
if you had the option of having fiat also.
Yeah.
So they may offer a discount. So what I generally predict is like, and the reason why I don't think that we go the fate of gold, like gold failed because it became centralized in the hands of custodians and governments and was unable to be a restraint on spending. The reason I think Bitcoin's different is because it's actually held by the people, not by governments. That's why that not your keys thing is so important. That's why it was so ingrained in whatever Satoshi wrote.
Not your keys, not your coins.
Not your keys, not
Get
your
your
coins.
Bitcoin off the exchanges.
Get them off the exchanges. I mean, we need you to, because this is how we defend ourselves from this happening again. But if we are sufficiently in control, the people, the users, the people of the world control this thing, then there is no possibility for demonetization. We have a shield to defend ourselves. And that's kind of what really drives this idea of the Bitcoin peace theory is that it's not this thing where Europe and in America, we'll just go off the gold standard. You won't be able to just go off the Bitcoin standard. That's not how it'll work because you won't own all the gold. You won't own all the Bitcoin. So you won't be able to do that. You'll be like actually limited. So we may actually live in this world where policymakers are actually limited by the monetary system because they don't control it, which is a beautiful thing in my view. It'll force them to be better governors. It'll force them to be more responsible, and especially with regard to war. So that's kind of the thesis, and I think what drives that eventually is merchant adoption. Like basically, we're already starting to see this, but what brings Bitcoin out of just a simple store of value technology into an actual currency, a money that we use, is merchant adoption, is merchants saying, you know what, I don't want your dollars. I would rather have your Bitcoin. This is Thier's law. It's like the opposite of Gresham's law, right? This is actually where the good money drives out the bad. Mm-hmm. We see this in dollarizing countries, right? And this is kind of where I see us eventually going is merchants saying, you know what, like, I'll even take a discount. I'd rather have discounted Bitcoin than full price fiat. Like this is what may eventually start to happen around the world, and at this point, it starts to things start to really move fast. You start to really think about what happens in a country like Venezuela, where people are like, "Oh, I don't really want the bolivars. I want to be paid in dollars. I don't care. Like I don't want no amount of bolivars will help here. Like not accepted anymore.
Not even trillions.
Yeah, you're gonna have in the next 5-10 years tons of businesses in the United States that basically are like, I don't want any dollars. I only want to be paid in Bitcoin, right? Pay me in Bitcoin is going to become like more of an obvious thing. So that's this long-term backdrop to what I've been trying to describe. But essentially, the idea is that both state actors and non-state actors start moving more towards a Bitcoin monetary standard, and I think it helps address the risks, the undemocratic risks of what fiat central banking has done to democracy with regard to these forever wars. And ironically, and a lot of Bitcoiners obviously would disagree with me, but I think it actually strengthens democracy rather than dilutes it into some sort of like city-state thing. I appreciate that perspective from a lot of people in the community. They think we're going to go into like a kind of a fractured, kind of localized thing, which may certainly happen.
I'm one of those people.
Yeah. But like it also just, if we're going to have democracies at scale, this makes them more responsible. Like it limits what they can do, which I'm quite excited about. So that's kind of the idea of Bitcoin peace theory is it prevents unnecessary wars. Yeah.
And for people saying like Bitcoin can never do this, Bitcoin can't work, it doesn't work, what do they need to do?
You read the book.
Check your financial privilege.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that I've published this book. Again, it has some of the chapters reflect some of the writings that we've been discussing here.
What's it like writing a book? I mean, I know you participated in a little Bitcoin book, but this is you.
No, this was my book. It's hard work. It takes an enormous amount of time, and it relies on the generosity of so many other people. So when I wrote this book, this is a book that's a collection of my reporting from around the world that looks at financial repression, monetary history, and global Bitcoin adoption over the last 2 years. And this book is the product of, yes, a lot of my like burning the midnight oil or you know, early in the morning, late at night, like whenever I can, just reading books, taking advantage. Thank you very much for Sci-Hub. Sci-Hub's amazing. Sci-Hub is a resource, just if you don't know, that is run by a communist in Kazakhstan who makes it JSTOR articles and research papers available for free to everybody. And I think it's an amazing gift to the world. And she runs on Bitcoin because her bank accounts got screwed up. So you should donate to Sci-Hub. I think it's important. But it gives me the ability to, like, for example, I can read a paper on German macroeconomic policy in 1963. Like you can go and do that through JSTOR. Like it's impossible otherwise.
They drove Aaron Schwartz to suicide,
I mean,
for trying to democratize this information.
People are monsters. So Sci-Hub, just many books, many JSTOR articles, and then interviews. Like the generosity of so many people around the world who gave me their time and perspective and told me about why money was broken and why did they turn to Bitcoin. So the book goes through stories from Nigeria and Palestine and Cuba and Sudan and Afghanistan and El Salvador and so many other places. And I try to kind of basically pair this idea of like checking your financial privilege, which is basically like, you know, look, you're probably someone who was born into, you know, premium fiat currency. And everything kind of probably works for you. But like that's not the case for like most people around the world. Most people are either born into an authoritarian regime or a weaker currency. And for them, like Bitcoin has been like very, very, very powerful, and it will continue to be very, very powerful. I mean, just think about like its impact in Ukraine and Russia right now. So the book is really proud to have it out. Again, it's to the thanks of so many people who've supported me on the journey, including you, Marty, and Matt, and your team, and be doing a book party and signing at Bitcoin 2022, and we'll be shilling it. One thing that's really cool is that we're turning the opening chapter into an animated short, which will I think debut at the conference or around then.
Hell yeah! So
we're working on that, and I have the voices of the actual people who are in the story. It's gonna be very cool. So we've got that coming. And yeah, I look, it's a book that's for curious minds that want to learn more about the actual impact this thing is having outside of our country. I do have a whole chapter about the United States. I interview Isaiah Jackson and someone who immigrated to our country recently, and we talk about how Bitcoin is actually quite a really strong kind of affirmation of American values of free speech, private property, and open capital markets. And we talk about how Bitcoin is actually really American at its roots. Mm-hmm. America, the idea, not America, the execution, right? So, you know, this whole Nixon and Kissinger petrodollar bullshit, like that's not American. No. Washington and Jefferson would have said, fuck that. So, you know.
We got Jefferson's the ordeal of liberty right here. And
yeah, I mean, the founding fathers were very suspicious of centrally planned money. So it's like, okay. You know, and I know Hamilton's been lionized lately through the play and everything. It's a great play. But, you know, he was in the minority camp, these people that wanted to have total control over all the money. A lot of the founders were like, nah. So one of the chapters looks into this, and we talk about how Bitcoin maybe can even improve some of the things that America have gone wrong here too. So it's not just, you know, in dictatorships far away. Bitcoin's having a huge impact in cities across the United States and communities here, obviously. So it's a global book. It's a global book.
Yeah, you can pick it up on Amazon.
Yep. It'll be out soon. In a couple of days, it'll be available on the Bitcoin Magazine website, and you'll be able to buy in Bitcoin.
Boss.
Which obviously would be cool. And yeah, I mean, you know, this is a book that you can hand to people who refuse to see the value in Bitcoin, especially when we talk about Bitcoin mining. If you don't understand that Bitcoin is valuable, then you're of course going to think it's a waste of energy or electricity. So this is step one. You have to understand that Bitcoin is a humanitarian tool, and it's being used by tens of millions of people around the world who who don't have the privilege you do. Once you are there, then we can have adult conversations about Bitcoin, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it desperately it provides desperately needed utility that does not exist outside of the Bitcoin.
I mean, it's very simple. How are you going to send money to your family in Russia right now? You can't, okay? Yeah. You can with Bitcoin. So it's like, you know, I think it's just time for people to start acknowledging this stuff. But at the end of the day, it also, you know, it hits the margins of this story I've been telling, you know, today about the history of money and where we're headed. And ultimately, and what we can conclude with this, like I think it's deeply unfair that 4% of the world's population controls the money for everybody. And Jack Dorsey said this in his recent interview with Michael Saylor. If you listen carefully, he basically said he didn't think it was fair for Nigerians that they be basically controlled by decisions of a small group of elites in Washington. Yeah, the people who sit around the table at the Fed. These people aren't even really elected, essentially, and they get to set the price of money for the whole world. This is insane. So in 100 years, we're going to look back at that and say, like, this was crazy. But it's how it works, and it's, you know, it's deeply self-interest. Like they will do what the elites in America want. Screw everybody else. As Nixon famously said, I don't give a shit about the lira. He said that after when they closed the gold standard. So the book, like, ultimately, yes, it's about like sympathizing with your fellow human around the world, but it's also this deep reflection on what it's been like to be someone who's been a beneficiary of the dollar hegemonic system, and knowing and trying to be humble about the fact that that's going to come to an end.
Yeah. And where do we want to go moving forward? We're essentially, Bitcoin allows us to transition to a new incentive system. If you really just want to distill it to what it is at the end of the day, an incentive system that does not allow for the petrodollar system that we've lived under over the last number of decades to proliferate and perturb the balance of the world the way it has.
Yeah, let's go back to a system that Adams and Jefferson would have appreciated, and not one that Nixon and Kissinger came up with.
Yeah.
And that's really what it's all about.
Let's do it. Well, Alex, it's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Yeah, we're gonna have to do it again. We got the studio here now, and
I'll be coming to Austin a couple times a year, so we'll do a lot of live shows.
Hell yeah. I know you have to get. You guys are doing a presentation soon at South by Southwest, right?
Yeah, we got a couple panels here. We're bringing the topic of freedom, you know, to the crowds, and yeah, it's exciting to be here. We come every year, but I intend to do more with the community here. Is just so supportive. It's great. I mean, Bitcoin Commons is an incredible space you guys have here. But you know, thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in Miami.
All right. Well, we'll see you in Miami. Go buy the book.